am going to start sharing our screen. And I hope many of you tuned into our first session last week. That was the first installment of our media literacy workshop, and today is our second installment. So thank you all so much. If you tuned in the first time, it was great to have you. And if you're tuning in again, we're excited to pick up where we left off. I do know that there are sometimes people who attend and tune in for the first time during our second. It's going to be useful just to be able to give you a little bit of a summary of what we went through in our first day. First, we introduced some of PEN America and the Denver Public Library's work in this space. And I can only speak for PEN America, but it's really impressive and exciting to partner with the Denver Public Library on this series because they have been doing this far longer than we have, working at the nexus of monitoring what we see online and helping to inform people like you and me and other friends and family that you might have about fake news and misleading information. And so it was really great. We had Ross, and we also had another one of his colleagues from the Denver Public Library on hand to be able to talk a little bit about what misleading content looks like, whether it is satire, misinformation, disinformation. We walked through a whole range, a kind of typology, if you will, of what we see online. And what we then walked you through was the history of disinformation and why we're so susceptible to it, knowing that there is this really powerful convergence of different issues that allow engagement and amplification of misleading content to reach us, that it often plays on our emotions when we see information that seems exciting, salacious, controversial. And how can we potentially then think about our role in all of this, in helping to minimize the spread of mis and disinformation? That's right where we left off. And so Ross was tremendous. He walked us through some really great examples of how different forms of misleading content play out. We're going to try to give you more examples today in case you need a refresher and you want to dust off what we did last week. In the next, 55 minutes, the rest of what we will be covering here in day 2 includes what we anticipate this election season. And then we're going to walk you through our media literacy toolkit, basically all of the questions you may have had from last time, applying all of those pieces of information to today. How can all of us take control of our online and digital experiences? If we know that humans are susceptible to disinformation, and we know that there will be an increase and kind of a deluge of that in the lead up to our November election, we want to be able to give you all the tools, the questions, the resources to be able to fight back and really make sense of what you see online. And then like last time, we're going to leave a little bit of time open for questions and answers. We have our chat function. If you want to share a resource, we're open to you using it in that way. And then we also have the Q&A function, which is the way that you can ask a question. And we will answer those in the last 15 or 10 minutes. So to kick us off, I thought it would be useful, we call these trainings media literacy in the disinformation age. Frankly, last time, I almost feel like part of what we helped provide for you was a sense that it's always the disinformation age, from propaganda, political slinging of accusations to political candidates in, 19th century American publications. We've really seen a range of ways that throughout the ages, misleading information has been used to sway people. But I believe that in the digital age, we are now seeing the proliferation and the reach of this type of information in far greater and more severe ways than ever before. And so just to give you a little bit of context of, what we're actually thinking about, I'm deeply terrified of the online ecosystem in the lead up to our election. I think a lot of us go to what we know. We go to Facebook, we go to Twitter, we go to our Instagram feed. If you're really cool, maybe you go to TikTok. And you look for what your friends, your family, your allies are talking about. And we're often not really on guard or thinking critically about what we see. This really became clear during the infodemic that reached kind of a fever pitch in March and April of this year. As the pandemic came to the United States and various cities and states went into lockdown and other kinds of restrictions around travel and working from home, we saw a few different things. One, we saw people working online, being online in greater ways and in more time than ever before. And yet we also saw a lot of content that was incredibly misleading and often harmful about the pandemic. Whether it was the film Plandemic, for example, which is a great example of a pseudo documentary trying to undermine scientific authority and institutions in the United States. We've seen efforts, frankly, from everyday people thinking they were helping their friends when they share stories that drinking bleach might help cure coronavirus, or potentially that if you gargle with saline, it will actually go away in your mouth. And so we've seen a lot of stories that in the scientific realm were relatively easy for leaders and scientists to debunk. And then part of what I began witnessing was as protests around the country proliferated, we saw more disinformation about issues such as what was happening online. And I know last time we gave you some examples of ways that fake social media accounts and fake email accounts like Gmail accounts were leading people to protests, for example, that actually were not happening at all. And in the lead up to the election, we are now already seeing efforts from a variety of actors across the political spectrum to stoke discord and to pull at the ways that we might feel confident in our electoral process. And so thinking about that has led me and led some of my other colleagues to really kind of take a deep dive look at what can we anticipate this election season. Because I have to say, Ross and I think and talk a lot about what can we give people, like in concrete ways to make them feel ready to take on and make sense of what they see. And I think one of the ways is knowing what we can anticipate. So if you take a look, for example, this was a really fun infographic that our friends from the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights put together last September. So that is almost a year ago now. Very surreal to think about, 11 months ago. So much of what they began mapping out are, I think, really legitimate concerns. And yet already we are seeing efforts to discredit the mail-in ballot voting process that isn't here. And so there are a lot of ways that we're going to have to, all of us, be nimble and on guard for what we might see in our news feeds. Some of what we do anticipate are the use of videos and the ways that videos uniquely might be ways for bad actors and frankly others just sharing information thinking they're doing it out of almost their civic duty. Videos can really be persuasive. We've seen in the protest context recently, for example, that videos have been one of the most powerful ways that people take in information, but captions might be misattributed, might be miscaptioned to make people believe certain things. And so we believe that in the lead up to the election, there may be deep fakes, which is basically videos used with computer and other AI software. But then there are also things like cheap fakes. An example is one of the Nancy Pelosi videos and the way it was manipulated to be slowed down as if to appear like she was under the influence, drinking, potentially on drugs. Those are ways that our own internal way of being on guard, we may not think that when we see a video. And so we are trying to expose people more and more to some of those examples. We also think that there are specific platforms that can be ripe for and provide really kind of rich ground for mis and disinformation to thrive. One of those is WhatsApp, which is a platform for people to engage with each other with messaging, private messaging. And what we've seen in other election contexts, for example, in India, is efforts by bad actors to infiltrate WhatsApp group conversations and to slowly integrate and introduce new topics that lead others in the group to perhaps change their bias, change their beliefs, scare people into certain things. And WhatsApp, as well as other messaging services, might be one of the other ways that we see a kind of infiltration of false and misleading narratives. And then one of the other things to really keep in mind is who is acting. And I know Ross is going to talk a little bit more about some of this, but how so many of us, I think, often naturally see the word disinformation. We think of some far away warehouse, maybe in Russia, where people are planning and hatching some scheme. And we see it because of the TV shows we watch and the movies we see. And part of what we are understanding as those that monitor these efforts is that there are absolutely foreign interference efforts, but there are also domestic efforts to infiltrate conversations and to stoke discord, which was one of the underlying themes we talked about last time around why we're so susceptible, how misleading content and narratives can really lead us to be moved in certain directions and can change our behaviors, our attitudes, and can really undermine the way that we might actually connect with others in some shared knowledge about what's happening in our country. And so in the lead up to the election, if there are ways that we can be undermined, many of these bad actors from foreign or domestic interference may try to slowly dissociate us, so that when Ross and I come together to speak, we may be seeing vastly different types of narratives in our news feeds. We may be thinking that the issues central to our election are different from one another. And that undermines our ability to then connect together and to connect with our friends, our family, even then to think about how we're actually going to be engaging in the electoral process. So I want to turn it over to Ross now. I feel like we kind of kicked it off. And one of the things that Ross has been looking at is these emerging examples of foreign and domestic interference. So Ross, will you take it away and walk us through these?
Sure. Yeah. So here's an example, and this is a very recent thing. It was about a week, maybe a week and a half ago, of sort of a new tactic that we're seeing from, at least from Russian disinformation efforts. And what it's doing is, this has a really long history kind of in KGB operations and stuff like that, is it's best if the truth is easier to hang on to and keep your story straight than an outright lie. So a lot of times there's a kernel of truth in what they're talking about. And this is an example of something that really has more than a kernel of truth. What this is for, this is a story that got exaggerated, but it's really a kind of a true story, but its purpose was to divide people, to divide Americans. So what we see here is these are protesters, a small group of BLM protesters in Portland. There was a man going around in a truck. He's an evangelist that goes up and down the West Coast giving out Bibles. He went to these protests and was giving out Bibles, and this is a graphic novel version of a Bible. So these protesters used this Bible to start a fire. And then they actually burned an American flag after that. And this is in the video if you look up this video. But what we see is that there was actually a Russian videographer at the protests, and he's working for this organization called Ruptly, which is a division of RT, or Russia Today, which is closely associated with the Russian government. So they recorded this video. You can watch this video online. So one graphic Bible was burned and one American flag was burned. A few other protesters later tried to put it out. Now in the next slide, if you look over here, we'll see the kind of amplification that we get. And it's almost like the old game telephone, how rumors will tend to get amplified and things like that. So here's a guy in Malaysia who he's kind of a right-wing person. I think he probably has connections to the United States. He's not affiliated with Russian disinformation efforts at all. But he says here, left-wing activists bring a stack of Bibles to burn in front of the federal courthouse. So there's two things that are untrue there. It wasn't a stack, and they didn't actually bring it. They were given these Bibles by an evangelist. So things kind of ramp up here. And then there were real efforts made to spread this story by, Russian disinformation operatives. So eventually, and Donald Trump Jr. shares it here, and he's not working necessarily with Russian disinformation people, but it suits what he wants to say, So he's saying, here are these activists burning Bibles, maybe they're the real fascists, saying that kind of thing. Ted Cruz says this is who they are. So he's saying that this small group of activists represent all BLM activists or even perhaps all liberals. And so this is the way that we see this thing kind of get amplified. So, but the crucial thing is that this is not really, it's not just a fake made up article. It's a real thing that happened that then got exaggerated and amplified artificially. So this is the kind of tactic that we might expect to see in the next few months up to the election. And then, okay, we're back to Nora.
Well, so I think, honestly, that's such an incredibly useful narrative to walk through, because it takes so much time to actually play out what these narratives are, and that there may actually be elements of truth. There might be what we described last time as the kernel of truth, or a patina of credibility, where stories that are ultimately misleading might have elements where something real did happen, but it has been then distorted and twisted and spun out to create more stories and narratives that, for readers at least, when they see it, they will make various assumptions. And so when we think about, why we need to be so careful and try to empower ourselves in what we see online, I think that's a really great example. And so part of what, I think the core of today is walking you all through what various elements are in our toolkit for you, the arsenal of tools and resources, and even questions to ask yourself when you think about what you're seeing online. And so the first thing that I always recommend, and that we recommend in our workshops, is to conduct a scan of how and where you consume information. If you were here last time, what you might remember is that we discussed quite a bit. Ross's colleague Robin posed a question early on, asking those of you here, where do you get your information and news? Do you get it from talk radio? Do you get it from one website like Fox News or the New York Times? Do you get it mostly from Facebook, which over 55% of American adults have said that is their primary source of news? Do you get it from Twitter? I think the first step in really thinking about how you can adapt and maybe alter your digital practices is to think about, well, what are my digital practices? And so that first step is what I say, the scan. Just think about how you get information. And because what that can then lead to is really an assessment of being able to take a step back and understand what your reactions might be. If you get all of your news from Facebook and you don't click on the links your friends share, that's a really great indicator of how you might be able to then adapt and diversify where you get your news. And it helps then in what step 2 is in questioning your reactions. Disinformation, I've said this before, I feel like Ross has said this, disinformation thrives on engagement. If we see something that has been liked and shared and commented on a lot, we want to get in on the action. We want to know what that salacious, controversial, exciting news and groundbreaking thing is. And the more that we understand that disinformation absolutely will flourish when we want to engage with it, that's kind of the point. And our emotions are a big aspect of why we are in this predicament, because people share things wanting to be part of the dialogue and discussion. And when we share things without confirming their veracity and their credibility, which is something we will get to, it can expose a greater number of people to those misleading stories. And so it's part of why I actually believe in our own way, we are all publishers. We all have the power to think about what we're posting, what we're not posting. We can even then think about what we're liking. If you like or share something, have you been able to really dig into it? Because that's what the majority of today will really be, is walking you through all of those steps. But to get there, you have to begin asking yourself the right questions. So it means thinking about what you're seeing. If you're seeing a video, perhaps the easiest question to ask is, oh, is this from today? Or is this from yesterday? Is this even from the United States? Those are the kinds of things that can actually make the difference then between you sharing something and hundreds, potentially more people being exposed to troubling, harmful, misleading content and not exposing people to that. So when we think about what the next step is, I want to make sure we turn it back to Ross, because Ross has some great ideas around all of this. But one of the questions is, how can we distinguish between news and opinion? Ross?
Yeah, so something to be aware of these days is if you think back to when newspapers were really just paper, a paper newspaper that you get, there was actually an opinion section and an op-ed section. It was its own section in the paper. Now today, when most people look at their news online, what's going on is news sites are struggling to make money, for one thing. And so they know that they have to get eyes on their stories. And the kind of article that gets shared the most really is various kinds of opinion and editorial pieces like that. Straight news, which is just straight factual reporting, which traditionally was in its own section of the paper, doesn't get shared as much. So it doesn't actually generate as much revenue. And so you really have to be careful these days when you're looking at the news, whether you're looking at an opinion piece or a straight news piece. Especially in these days, even on TV, the line has really blurred between those two things. You get cable news stations where there are pundits that's really opinion, and then there are people reporting straight news stories at the same time. So over here in the next slide is just an example of something to watch for. Here are some things from the Denver Post that I pulled today. Opinion columns, if you start to really pay attention at the top here, most reputable papers anyway, reputable news sources will label things as opinion or editorial or a letter to the editor, something like that. But as you can see over here on the right, this is from a few months ago, but what is read the most, everything on here, I pulled this off in a screenshot here. This is on the Washington Post. Everything on here is opinion or something similar. So there's various opinion things here. There's perspective, which is really a kind of opinion. And then there's analysis, which is really somebody, looking at it and sort of offering an expert opinion or analysis on something, but it's none of this is straight news, but this is what people share the most. So it's good to be careful about the distinction there. Okay, and then another important thing is, before you share, consider the source. This is something that we say in our classes all the time, and it's something that librarians say and journalists say a lot, is consider the source. For example, let's say you see something on Facebook that says the Denver Guardian. Now that sounds legitimate, that sounds like the name of a real paper, but it's important to remember that anybody can post something like that. It's good to check to see if it's credible. So for example, on the next slide, the Denver Guardian really was a truly fake news site, just not really an imposter news site, but just a made up news site that was going around in 2016. So here we see on Facebook, somebody is sharing something, and it purports to be from a paper called the Denver Guardian. and it says FBI agent suspected in, it says Hillary Clinton had an FBI agent murdered and burned his house down. So the two issues here, one is that there was no real paper called the Denver Guardian. This is completely fake, and it was made up by a guy who had an entire network of fake news sites, apparently just to make money, among other things, and just to kind of troll people. And we'll get into this later, he used a photo out of context, but I don't want to talk about that just yet. Then on the next slide here, this is another example of how misleading things can be. This also looks kind of legitimate, although this big blank space in the middle is kind of a clue here that something is a little bit strange. This is called the Denver City Wire, and this is also fake news, but it's a different kind. It's called what's called pink slime news or pink slime journalism these days. And what this is one of an entire network of about 450 sort of faux news sites. And almost all of the content here, I'm not going to go into it and click around and show you, but you'll find a lot of dead links. You'll find a lot of stuff that's just algorithmically generated, which means it's really generated by artificial intelligence, oftentimes pulled from public websites. Over here, you'll see things, it's a lot of statistics, but almost all of these articles are not made by a human. And then the ones that are, there's a few that generally are furthering an agenda. So there'll be a few articles in here, and this happens to be owned by somebody with a conservative agenda. So they'll write a few articles and post them in here. But there is really no Denver City Wire. And if you follow at the bottom of this, you'll see several other sites all around Colorado. There's the Grand Junction Times, the different things like that. There's so many of these that really just aren't real.
Which I think kind of begs the question of, well, how can we recognize what are real legitimate sites? And it's really hard. I mean, thankfully, Ross has pointed out some of the hallmarks, if you will, when you're on a site that might be a pink slime site, which is one of my favorite phrases, frankly. I wish it weren't so fun because it really denotes something not good. But you know, when we are on those types of sites, it's great to look for, you know, dead links, which seem to be pretty prevalent, and for what might be articles that actually aren't real. Like when you finally click on them, they're a set of computer generated terms and statistics. Another is the masthead. You know, part of what's so misleading is that oftentimes these sites have what feel like really authentic mastheads. Their names, I noted, Ross, from the Denver Guardian to the Denver City Wire, those feel like things that you could cite to. And so it's really hard to recognize, well, what is not credible? What might be a fake news site or a pink slime site? And so part of what we've done is tried to help walk people through what credible journalism is. And a lot of those, a lot of the hallmarks of it, we draw on from Columbia Review's sort of breakdown that they did in partnership with the Society of Professional Journalists, and thinking about what are those elements, the ethics, the quality, and the standards that journalists, that editors, that others in the media industry really try to ascribe to. And many of these feel intuitive. You know, it's sort of like when you're reading an article that is an investigative piece, not an opinion piece. You may see that there are elements of, you know, sources being quoted, and the accuracy, the attribution of various elements really are of a high professional quality. There may even be instances in which maybe a reporter gets it wrong. And when they do, one of the hallmarks of credible journalism is a speedy corrections policy. And so part of what PEN America has actually been doing over the last year and a half has been monitoring with about 50 outlets, national and regional outlets around the country, what do various outlets provide when it comes to their ethics, their standards, and their other quality policies, and how transparent are they? So it's great if you want to take a look at our newsroom transparency tracker. That's just an easy resource which provides a breakdown of some of these hallmarks for different outlets around the country. But there is sort of this underlying question I've seen recently when it comes to fairness and objectivity. If you look over even from ethics and standards, there is sort of this avoidance of emotionality that Hallmark credible journalism seems to promote. And what we've seen actually of late is instances in which journalists have really kind of bubbled up the concern that is objectivity or lack of emotion the only way to go? And so a really interesting example has been in recent months, we've seen Black reporters trying to shine a light on systemic racism and instances of violence, and what does it mean to somehow have this reckoning now over what objectivity looks like in journalism. And so it really isn't that we're able to point to all of the answers here, but that some of the questions, especially the questions some journalists are now thinking about, are really serious, and ones that I believe will be discussed for some time. You know, in our series with the Denver Public Library, PEN America brought together a kind of panel of speakers who are editors and journalists and various outlets they belong to, such as the Denver Post, Denverite, and other outlets. And part of what we examined was this question of, what does bias mean? What does emotion mean? What does it mean for reporters to talk about those things? And so an example of really what we've seen of late is this Alexis Johnson story. She is a reporter in Pennsylvania, and she was going to be covering the George Floyd protests and put on her Twitter feed various images that you can see here of what looks like trash and almost looting. And she said, oh, this is horrible, the aftermath of all these horrible, selfish looters. And then she said, oh, wait, these are pictures from a Kenny Chesney concert tailgate. And that post led to her being barred by her outlet in Pittsburgh from covering the local protests. And so it was really in this period, at the end of May, the beginning of June, through June, that a lot of reporters started asking that question. And we've had some really interesting conversations about it. And so, you know, if you're interested, tune in to our Reporting in the Disinformation Age event, which we hosted and which is live, or which is available in a recording, because we really explore a lot of those questions. But I'm going to turn it back to Ross to help talk you through what fact-checking actually means, because I think that's a term we get asked all the time.
Okay, so I don't know, some of you may have noticed, even though I live in Denver, I have a bit of a Southern accent. And here you see is that I'm from Arkansas, and here is a man tries to trade kidnapped baby for 15 Big Macs at an Arkansas McDonald's. So this here is an example of truly fake, just nonsense news. And you can find that, I mean, it rings your bells in the first place. This doesn't quite sound true, but it's a strange world, so things can happen. But if we look at the next slide here, we'll see all you really have to do is open up a new tab with something that is truly fake like this. Open up a new tab while you're browsing and just do a Google search for the title of the publication that you're looking for. And you're immediately going to see that some of the fact-checking websites I'm going to mention later pop up. And as soon as you see something like this, PolitiFact, Snopes, CBS News, fake news sites to watch out for, another Snopes article, this means this is, you can just navigate away. This is not something that's going to be that credible at all. So I'm proud to say that didn't actually happen in my home state. Next slide. Here we see verifying images. So there's various ways to verify images, and generally speaking, I'll say off the first of all is the easiest way is to look and to see if an expert or professional has already done it, because this can be really hard. and I'll talk about that in a second. One way is to do a reverse image search. Google has a feature where if you're on Google Chrome, you can just right click and search Google for an image and see where that comes from. There's also TinEye. There's various other reverse image applications. And consider things like what you're really considering with pictures and really also with quotes and a lot of fake news is the context. Is this taken out of context? Because if you take something out of context, you can turn something true into a lie. And that's a very common thing to do. And here's a video we recommend, or here's something we recommend looking at, the Pocket Guide to Verifying Videos. But here, let's look again at, this is the picture used in that Denver Guardian, the fake news site that we saw a little while ago. And if you look here, some of you guys may have used Flickr. This is just a photo sharing site. So whoever was making the Denver Guardian took this picture and all this is really is somebody took a picture of their neighbor's house burning down. It just happened to be a fire next door, and he took a picture and posted it to Flickr. And the Denver Guardian used that to claim that Hillary Clinton had burned somebody's house down in order to assassinate them. So this is the kind of thing that can happen with photographs. On the next slide here, we see this is an example of a more subtle kind of thing going on. Here you see, this is an example of a picture I actually saw shared on Facebook the other day. And it was shared by someone who legitimately was wrong. They weren't trying to deceive anyone, but they were wrong about what is going on in this picture. And what we see here is that my friend thought that this was a federal agent, an unmarked federal agent in Portland. And that's actually not. And this took me about an hour of searching to figure out what's really going on. So that kind of talks about how tough this can be. This is actually not in Portland. It is a BLM protest, but it's in Columbia, South Carolina. If you look, there's a photographer took a lot of pictures like this. This is actually a South Carolina state trooper or maybe a South Carolina state SWAT officer, something like that. But what's really interesting about this is this picture was taken with a telephoto lens. And what that does is compress, if there are any photographers here, compresses the perspective. So it looks like he's pointing that gun right at her neck. It's a rubber bullet shotgun, but he's actually not. It looks like they're right together, but they're not. He's a few feet behind her, and you can see that he looks a little smaller than her. And you can see that in the other pictures. Now, he is pointing at people behind her, and so you could have a discussion about that. But this image is misleading for reasons that nobody really intentionally tried to do. It's just that it's the quality of the picture. And you'll see the same effect that shows up with pictures of Denver. You know, it looks like the mountains loom right behind the skyline because it's taken with a telephoto lens. So pictures, even real photographs, can really be deceiving and in many different ways. In the next slide. And another thing to remember is verify accounts. It's always important to verify social media accounts, Twitter accounts, even emails that you get. And Nora talked about these two examples last week. So here's a fake account of Rashida Tlaib, which says, you know, Americans have spent decades raping and pillaging my people. And this really isn't her. This is an I in her name instead of an L. So this is not true. And the way you can, there are different ways you can find this kind of stuff. You know, look for a check mark on Twitter. Look to see if there's a low number of followers for what you would think of someone so prominent. If the account is very, very new, things like that. And then over here, with fake Gmail accounts, that's really harder to find. Nora may have ideas for how to find that. Sometimes you can hover over a website or over an address and it will show you a different address. That can happen. but just be careful about things like this. And if you do see things like this, it's always good to report it to either Facebook or Google or wherever you see it happening.
You know, another thing, Ross, that I've seen recently is people screenshotting things like this, like what you and I are featuring in this training, and then posting the screenshot of someone's tweet on Facebook. A great example that I just saw before the training, it was only a few minutes before, so I couldn't even pull it to put it in our slides, was something about, I think, Barack Obama, and that someone had taken a screenshot on their phone of him tweeting and then put that on Facebook. And it was something very moving, and everyone who was engaging with this post was really excited. It was, I think, because of Democratic Convention. And my question to myself was this a real tweet of his? Because there are easily ways that if you're posting an image, it could have been spliced together. That language from, you know, your own Word document that you just put in the right small framework and size could then be imposed on even a fake and manipulated Twitter handle. And so it's almost, I mean, I'm glad that Ross also talked a little bit about how much time it can take, because the time that I then spent reaching out to my friend and saying, hey, you know, privately, I didn't want to engage in the post publicly. So I sent him a message and I said, can you confirm that this is actually Barack Obama's tweet? Where did you get this image? And, you know, it can be exhausting in a weird way, but if you really want to search and go the full span to figure out where it originates, it really can take time. And so it's good at the very least to start questioning these things. And I know that I'm sort of that person now with my friends, that people won't share things until they verified with me. And they're like, we know if we share with Nora, then she's going to ask where it came from. But it's a great habit to actually get into if you can. So I just sort of posed that because it just happened a few minutes before our workshop. Ross, you want to kind of walk people through some of the fact checking?
Yeah, so just a few fact checking sites that are really good. Like I just said, these are professionals that do a lot of behind the scenes work. Sometimes you'll see, just the other day, I saw somebody, in fact, it was about that image from South Carolina, saying people should do their own research. And, you know, I thought, yes, they should. That's a very good idea for people to do their own research, but don't think it's easy. You know, it's not a 2-minute thing to do your own research and find the top Google search and say, okay, there it is. So these people have done a lot of work on this kind of stuff. So the first one that I like a lot is PolitiFact. They do a lot of fact checking. I like this. They have the pants on fire rating when someone is telling just a complete fib. But they'll also rate, you know, degrees of truth. They have a truthometer that they'll use sometimes. The next slide here is, I've put in factcheck.org twice. Did I? Okay. Well, there's PolitiFact and FactCheck. And keep in mind both of those that you'll want to check. FactCheck is a project of the Annenberg Public Policy Center. PolitiFact is the Tampa Bay Times. I think they're both very good. The next one here is a fact checker at the Washington Post. He gives people Pinocchios depending on how truthful or not truthful he thinks it is. So occasionally you'll see that he gives people a Geppetto check mark if they completely tell the truth. So that's a good thing to see every once in a while. And then at the end here, I would encourage everyone to watch this video. I don't have time to show it now, but at the end here we have Snopes. And you've all heard of Snopes, I'm sure. And there's often questions about Snopes, and really questions about all fact checkers. And people wonder if perhaps they have a liberal bias or conservative bias or who they are and things like that. What I always tell people is, for all fact checking sites, for one thing, check multiple ones. If you find a really big story, it's probably been covered by a couple of different fact checkers. So check different ones and see if you can sort of triangulate them to see if they're all saying the same thing. If they are, then that's a good sign because they're not connected. Another thing to do is just go through the same steps that they did. Look at the article, read the full article, and look at who they called, look at the resources they went to, and see for yourself if it makes sense to you, the steps they went through. They will all show their work, just like teachers used to say, show your work. They will do that. The thing with Snopes is different from the other fact-checking sites, and partly it's because it's a couple, and they started out, I think they were college professors, and they were researching urban legends and saying whether urban legends are true or false. So, you know, hitchhikers and things like that. And then there came to be a demand for fact checking. So that's how they started. So it is different. In the next slide here, I want to show you a couple things. These are different. This is the Duke Reporters Lab keeps a database of fact checkers from around the world. So if you're tuning in from another country, for example, or if you have friends in another country or looking for local fact checking resources, check the Duke Reporters Lab because it's good for that. And then over here next on the next slide, here's NewsGuard, which is an app that you can download that will kind of rate sites for trustworthiness. But they are maintaining a list of sites during the coronavirus outbreak that they have identified as putting out really bad information. So it's good to check this. If you see something, you can check it against this at NewsGuard. And then finally, I just want to say, with this current situation with coronavirus, it's good to check the things like the World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and then the more local things, like there's a Colorado State Public Health Agency and then a Denver Public Health Agency. And again, something with coronavirus is that this is a very new thing, and these agencies don't always agree on their recommendations, and even nobody really knows what's going on with this virus. But they are experts. They're people with lots and lots of degrees and experience. So it's still good to look and maybe check both the World Health Organization and the CDC, kind of look at what they're both saying and then, you know, make your decisions there. And then next slide, I think that's all of our fact-checking sites. Oh no, there's one more. These are the Colorado level ones. So the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment recently won an award, I think, for the quality of their data and their modeling related to COVID. And then there's also the Denver Department of Public Health and Environment. So lots of good information on these.
Okay, those are great, Ross. Thank you. Well, you know, we are at, about 6:51 for me. I'm on the East Coast, but we have about 9 more minutes of time. And what we wanted to do was frankly open it up for questions. So for you all to be aware, when we send you an email tomorrow, we'll include the list of resources that Ross just walked through, the fact-checking websites. We'll also provide some of our resources, both the Denver Public Library, which has been developing some fantastic one-pagers that honestly I consult. And then PEN America has also been developing some very topic-specific ways of addressing disinformation about COVID, about protests, and we're going to actually be releasing some new guides on election issues. So we'll send you the existing resources that both organizations have, and when we do officially wrap up, one of the things that we hope you'll do is fill out our post-workshop survey. Those really truly help all of us. They help us to adapt and tailor our curriculum. If there were certain examples you absolutely loved, we love hearing that. And it really is helpful for us in figuring out how we build our wonderful programming for all of you. If you want to stay in touch, at least with Penn, I know I put our handles. I also then put the Denver Public Library's handle here on Twitter. That's one of the most immediate ways that if you see examples of mis and disinformation, we love to hear about it. We love to hear about the things that you're concerned about, if there are other things that you're aware of. So with that, I will open it up. I know we have a couple of questions, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I will turn to our questions. Let's see. It looks like we have about 4 that are currently open. Why don't we start with really interesting question. Someone says, I wonder if deepfakes will get worse or harder to identify with the proliferation of these Zoom calls and interviews. I'm happy to answer that, Ross, unless if you have thoughts, weigh in whenever.
No, go ahead.
One of the, certainly deepfakes, I don't think will get worse in that context, because deepfakes are, computer generated videos. And so they are bad across the board. The technology is always getting better and better. What I think could be interesting is to actually consider how lower and less sophisticated videos like cheap fakes or what might be a little below deep fakes, if people were recording these conversations and then using that footage to manipulate it. PEN America is not interested in manipulating video footage of me and Ross. I don't know if any other attendees, if they're recording things and wanting to manipulate, it's kind of a fascinating question, but I don't know anyone that's actually working on that issue in light of the proliferation of Zoom calls and discussions. I don't know if you're aware of anything else, Ross.
No, I don't see, deepfakes are going to get more sophisticated and harder to recognize, but not necessarily in an instantaneous context like a Zoom call, at least for a while. That would be much more advanced technology than I've ever heard of existing.
Well, the next question is, considering change in COVID reporting, do you have any guidance on COVID-related statistics?
I would say check multiple agencies, see what you think about that, because they, especially with models, this is different from statistics, but forecasts and things like that will differ from site to site, from agency to agency. So check multiple ones and kind of get a feel that way. Statistics, one thing I would say is make sure you're reading the graphs and things like that correctly. It's very easy to, and maybe even we have books on how to read graphs and maps and things. There are books called How to Lie with Statistics and How to Lie with Charts, that sort of thing. So make sure you're up on that. It can be really easy to misinterpret a graph or to even lie with a graph. What are your thoughts, Nora?
Frankly, one of my biggest concerns is lack of statistics. There are various states that have not actually been reporting on or making publicly available their COVID-related statistics, whether it's infection rates, death rates, which offices, for example, are responding or not responding to FOIA and open records requests. And so in another area of our work at PEN America, oh, you can see my dog. In another area of PEN America's work, we've actually been monitoring sort of that trend towards what happens under cover of Corona when, people are worried about the thing over here and not able to or really have access to statistics and the role of reporters in a lot of that. So I think that, a question we often get is related to this about how do we deal with the silencing or potentially the chilling of scientific records by government officials. And that's something that we, PEN America, have seen in other countries, countries where leaders do not want citizens to understand the full breadth or severity, perhaps, of the pandemic. And so frankly, this is a very long answer just to say that we're incredibly concerned actually about it. I think that it is an instance here of US practices across the board seeming to remind us of other countries sometimes. When governors or other officials bar reporters from asking questions, when state and federal agencies suspend their open records so that people can't even have access to those statistics, it's very troubling. So those are just sort of a kind of rundown of what we're thinking about and how we're monitoring this. Otherwise, I'm not sure the changes in reporting per se, though I would point you to Pointer, which has been doing really great reporting on the effects of the pandemic. And they, in covering a lot of this, have been one of the best, I would say, in their reporting. So the next question is, when you encounter, it's my favorite question. This is the question, I don't know, Ross, if you get this more than any other question, we get this more than any other question. When you encounter misinformation, what is the best way to respond on that platform? And I wish I had it ready. We're about to release a guide on this very topic. So stay tuned, truly, and make sure that you sign up for our emails because it's coming out very soon. But I have a number of recommendations. So you get a quick prelude to that guide that we're releasing. And I'd love to hear Ross's thoughts as well. One of my first comments is how you engage with a post. So depending on who posted it, you'll want to respond a little differently. If it is something where you follow the New York Times on Facebook and they posted it, that's different, I think, than if Ross, my friend, posts something on Facebook. And how I might respond to Ross would be different on a platform like on Facebook than how I would respond to the New York Times posting a story. And frankly, that gets into the kind of bias of different news outlets. But let's say your friend has posted something. What I always recommend is to not publicly engage with the post. What that does is actually increase engagements. So if Ross has posted something that could be, let's say, gargling with saline helps minimize coronavirus in your mouth. I don't think Ross would do it, but let's just pretend. So if he does that, I think one of the worst things you can do is publicly comment on his post saying, Ross, this is fake news. That can do a number of things to people. One, Ross will read that and feel horrible probably. He'll either be embarrassed or angry or some other kind of level of shame, frankly. One time it happened to me years ago and I was mortified by sharing something that I didn't know was fake on Facebook. And when someone called me out publicly, I immediately deleted the post, but then I felt bad doing that as well. So you kind of never want to call people out publicly. The other reason though is that it will really just build for the algorithms interest in promoting the post. So it will be seen by more people. So I always suggest sending private messages to your friends and posing things with a level of empathy, where you might say, Ross, I saw your post about gargling with saline. That seemed interesting. I'm not sure if you have fact checked it. Have you been able to confirm that that's credible right now? We're dealing with a lot of fake and misleading information. And if you pose it almost like a question, I think it helps minimize that feeling of shame or anxiety or embarrassment. And so those are the very top suggestions on my end. I think there are also just the practical tips of reporting content, that if something seems directly harmful, for example, like let's say Ross posts something and when you message him, he gets angry and says, you're lying to me. Because we've seen that, people that might be your friends or family, and their reaction is not open, not receptive. In those instances, you have to then, I think, take more aggressive action by reporting something that actually could be harmful and misleading to people. But I'd be really curious, Ross, if you have other recommendations.
I really don't. I would say basically the same things you just said. The only thing I would say is don't hesitate to try those things that Nora was talking about, because it really does work. I messaged somebody who completely disagrees with me and everything about his worldview and said, hey, this is what you're sharing is false, and it had been shared, I think 5,000 times, and he took it down. So you can make a difference.
Do you want to take the next question,
Sure.
Ross, about media professionals and others?
Let me read over it here.
I'll read it out loud for the audience so they can see it. It
Oh,
says,
yeah, that's a good idea.
as media professionals, what are the critical intervention points to reach the public and increase awareness and education? Is it K through 12 school curriculum? Is it media platform governance, legal intervention of mis and disinformation? I'm happy to weigh in after you, Ross. I would say librarians. Can I just like
librarians?
That? Because librarians are the ambassadors of truth. But
we do try to be. We always want you to call us, email us, things like that, and ask us. That is one good way. School curriculums, there's a lot of good that you can do with that. There are there are organizations doing things like that. There's something called Checkology that you may want to check out that just became free, which is extremely useful for people like homeschoolers and things like that. Right now, people who are new homeschoolers that never did until this year. One thing I tend to say is people who, at the other end of the lifespan, it's important to focus on older people that may not have a lot of experience with technology. That has been shown that those folks can be who share and believe the most disinformation. So that can happen a lot just because of their lower tech savviness and the fact that they grew up in a different media environment. I'm going to let Nora talk about the legal intervention because she is an attorney.
Sure. I am incredibly reticent of legal interventions posed or introduced by governments that, for example, one common tactic is the introduction of criminal statutes around the world that would essentially create penalties if you are a purveyor of disinformation. It sounds, I have to admit, intuitively great. Yes, let's create some avenue where people who are promoting and doing so with knowledge that they're promoting fake information, let's find avenues to, get rid of that. However, the reason that I am concerned by that is because we have seen those statutes more often than not. I want to say every time I've seen a statute introduced, from Egypt to Morocco and other places around the world, that Singapore has sort of the most broad and pervasive statute like this, that what ends up happening is that dissidents, political dissent, and primarily reporters get targeted with these laws. And so I'm very reticent of those types of legal interventions. There are, however, and this sort of answers another question someone has posed, there are some legislative efforts and conversations about legislation that could introduce curriculum for either K through 12 or middle school or high school, and that those types of curricula, if built out and built into states or at the federal level, could be really powerful ways to inoculate people. That early on, if we get students and young people, kind of to Ross's point, that those are really exciting and promising conversations. They're still just conversations. Amy Klobuchar has introduced a piece of federal legislation last year, so this was back in 2019, that was the Digital and Media Literacy Act. I think I might be missing one word in there, but it was an effort to begin the conversation here in trying to get traction politically for this. There are also then state legislative efforts underway in various states. And so if that's something you are interested in, I truly mean it, like reach out to me, because I'm monitoring and working on the legislative issues around media literacy curriculum. And our partners, for example, at Namely are also working on that. Colorado is a very, very rich place where I think there is openness for these issues and political legislative conversations. I know we're over time. If people are still around, should we try to answer maybe one more question, Ross?
Sure. So the next question here, is there any way of getting standardized media literacy education into schools without triggering a political argument about what is fake news? I don't know. I mean, you could, political arguments about what is fake news are very easy to trigger. I don't know if that could always be avoided. But I think I can just take an example from my experience. People often come to our talks about, you know, how to spot disinformation, and you can tell that they're ready to argue. They're ready for us to have a bias on one side or another. And once they sit down and listen to us and realize that we're talking about things that happen on both sides, and we are trying to be as unbiased as we can, they usually don't. You know, they usually think that we're actually doing a pretty good job. And I think that is probably what happens with things like Checkology and other information and media literacy efforts.
That's great. Well, let's end there. I know we had more questions. I want to make sure I didn't miss any, but we're now about 10 minutes over time. We will be sending, just to remind you one more time, we'll be sending an email tomorrow with resources from the Denver Public Library and from PEN America on a lot of these topics. And when we sign out now, we will be, I'm so sorry about that noise. We will be, Ross, you want to close us out?
Sure. Thank you. And everybody look for the email that's coming out later. And I just want to thank Nora and PEN America for being here, and for everybody for coming to these last three sessions. I think it's been great.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Great.